Hello everybody, this is Robert Barton here at North Carolina State University, and I'll be moderating today's IBIS session. Today's topic is Society and Bioenergy, a Public Perception Study. And our speaker today is Dr. Sudipta Dasmohapatra. She is an assistant professor in marketing here at the Department of Forest Biomaterials at North Carolina State University. Prior to joining North Carolina State in 2007, she worked in a market research consulting for about 4 years, focusing on providing data-based solutions to market problems for Fortune 500 companies. Dr. Dasmohapatra received her PhD in Forest Products Marketing from Pennsylvania State University and an MS in Forest Management from Indian Institute of Forest Management in India. Her research interests focus on understanding customer values in forest products markets, data-based marketing solutions, and social aspects in marketing. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sudipta.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about Society and Bioenergy, a Public Perception Study for the IBIS project. And what I'm going to really talk, in gist today is to give you a little bit of introduction of what it really means, when we think about public perception and bioenergy. And then I'll talk a little bit about a pilot study that we had conducted a couple of years ago, and then talk more about what are our plans within this within the IBIS project, to do the public perception study. We have actually already started with some phases of in the study and where we are and what we are planning to do over the next year or so. So moving on to the next slide. Basically, according to the market, to the marketing research world, there are several factors that affect a product success in the marketplace. And we can think about this product as, biofuels or a biochemical product, that really, it could be anything that's related to a bioenergy product. And so for the product success, we really need for the product to be economically attractive, and that's given the fact that almost every business operates to actually make money, that is really important. And the other aspect of it is ecologically sustainable, and so we are looking at it in the bioenergy products as well as in all the other kinds of products today in this realm of of climate change. And when we are talking about different impacts on the environment, large businesses and small businesses and retailers and so on, everybody's talking about this, then looking at the products being ecologically sustainable is also important for a product success. The other aspect of it, which I'm actually going to touch today, is basically the socially acceptable part, which is that the product has to be socially acceptable for it to be consumed in the marketplace. And you would see below these three areas that we talk about for the product success. Of course, technical feasibility is very, very important. And so I commend all the colleagues that are actually working in this particular area, looking at pre-treatments and treatments and processing aspects, because that has to be definitely there. The technical feasibility has to be there in order to make sure that we can talk about economic attractiveness, ecological sustainability, and social acceptability. And on top, you would see that I talk a little bit about legal and policy framework. All this kind of works around the legal and policy framework that, within which the market system operates. So when we talk about, for example, subsidies to farmers, and, other kind of regulatory policies, all that will actually affect, how the bioenergy marketplace looks like today. And when we talk about sustainability, all these three are also the most important goals. And again, we want to achieve sustainability during product production and consumption of these products. And so profits, environmental well-being, and human well-being are equally responsible for a truly sustainable environment in the marketplace today. So we kind of started for the IBIS project. We started with looking at some of the past studies, that have been done on stakeholder perceptions, or the social perceptions, I should say. And pretty much what we are looking for in the social perceptions is the understanding or the perception of the general public, and the general public may involve, your different type of stakeholders like your consumers, or researchers and the industry folks, the non-government organizations, and how everybody really perceives, this particular industry, and the different aspects of the industry is important. So we actually looked at the past studies, and it seems like the majority of studies in the area of bioenergy basically focus on technical barriers, and that's not surprising, because that's really important, one of the most important aspects. The other two important barriers for bioenergy success in the marketplace have been, and they have been shown as or reported as economic and sociopolitical. Like one of the studies that I kind of mentioned here by Monroe in 2010 basically says that economic issues are important, and they do include even market forces such as consumer acceptance that really affect the demand of biofuels and or other kinds of bioenergy products in the marketplace. When we look at the past studies, there are only a few comprehensive studies that have been done on social barriers, or looking at, how does the public really value, the bioenergy products, or even like the feedstocks. There are, most of the studies are really fragmented. Either they focus just on a local area, or they are region specific, or they are stakeholder group specific. So we really could not find studies that focused on, many of these stakeholder groups that we are talking about, and compared and contrasted about how these different stakeholder groups really perceive the overall area of bioenergy and the aspects of bioenergy. The other thing that we basically found was that all the social, economic, environmental, and the policy aspects were not studied in any of these social studies, and that's something that we are planning to do. How does the price really affect people's perception versus, the social well-being or the community aspects, or the environmental aspects of the environmental impact, and or subsidies and regulations from the government. So we're trying to create a comprehensive study for the IBIS project to actually look at all of these different aspects, which we could not find in any single study that has been done. The other thing that we have found is that most of the studies that focus on the social barriers are actually more focused on different areas within Europe, and very fragmented within the U.S. So what we are thinking is to collect data from some of the southeastern states here in the U.S., for our study, and then to compare it with other studies that we have our colleagues from the CAP project are doing across, the other regions of the U.S., and then we will see, how do the results from these compare and contrast. So we have, some group of folks that are working on the northeastern part of the United States, and they would be collecting similar data on, for different stakeholder groups. We have some other colleagues that are also working on collecting data from the public in the Pacific Northwest, and other parts of the northern part of the country. And so it's, that's a good thing. So we are all working together to try to make sure we can provide, provide results that are region specific, but also those that can be compared and contrasted across different regions. The other thing is that we also found that one of the groups that were neglected really in almost all the studies, we really have not been able to find any study that actually looked at the investor group. Maybe there were a couple of studies that looked at one investor and what their thoughts were, but here in our study we are actually looking at the investment or community as one of the stakeholder groups that, to understand what are their motivations, or what kind of information gap there is, in their perceptions of the bioenergy industry, where they would like the information, and so on and so forth. So we were hoping that all these, taking all these together is really, really going to help, the research focus and or the other kinds of focus as we look towards integrating the social aspects with the environmental aspects and the monetary aspects of the bioenergy product in the marketplace. So I kind of did not mention this at first, but I'm thinking that maybe if you guys let me kind of go through my slides, and at the end, I would be happy to take any kind of questions. I'm hoping to finish in another 30 minutes or so, so that will give us 15, 20 minutes to actually answer questions. So I'm hoping everybody is okay with that. Going to the next slide, and talking more about lessons learned from the past studies. Again, like I said, most of the work has been done either, for a particular stakeholder group or a particular area, or, given a particular time, as well as, in a lot of them in mature markets of Europe, where energy and energy regulations have been there for a long, long time. And so, collecting similar data in the U.S. is going to be really, really useful. We've found from past studies that where we have different stakeholder groups, providing information on their perceptions of the bioenergy area, there's quite a bit of confusion on what bioenergy really means. The definition of bioenergy, therefore, needs to be very specific when we are collecting data from these different stakeholders. Are we talking about pellets for heating, or are we talking about biomass for electricity versus, biofuels for transportation? So that has to be pretty clear, because that's something that is creating a lot of confusion not only in the understanding but also in reporting. The other thing that we have found from past studies is that customers are very price sensitive. However, the dynamic of the decision making has been changing, meaning, if we look at the demography, in younger versus mature markets, some of the younger demography, for example, would, people who are within the ages of 18 to 30, 35 are basically viewing the bioenergy market in a different way as compared to the other type of age groups. So it is perceived differently among demography, and therefore maybe, one of the ways to go about it is to look at the market is to segment the market into different groups, and look at the characteristics of each of the segments and what kind of information and what their perception is for each of the segments. So we are actually thinking about doing a segmentation study using all the data that we collect. The other one is potential resources and expected market changes are very localized for the type of studies that we have seen, and that is really something important to note, that how people or the public perceives the energy industry is completely based on the local marketplace, as well as what kind of resources are available locally. And so we'll keep that in mind as we are kind of going through our study. There's also quite a bit of discussion about standards and certification needs and so on as we talk about the bioenergy market, and that's something where people have a lot of confusion, or the general public has a lot of confusion. So we can so that's something to keep in mind when we are doing these studies. And the other thing is what do you do when you actually at the end, when we get these results or when we have collected the data? And so really what it needs to translate into, the results need to translate into, how do we create how do we improve the acceptance of the public through innovation in education, especially if this is a good thing for the nation. If we really think that this is the way to go, then we should probably think about how to modulate the acceptance of the public through different type of educational tools and resources. And so one of the ways in which we are going to look at how do we translate these results through not our different types of outreach efforts, and that would be a big part of our study also. Going to the next slide. So the objectives of this area of our project is to look at or examine the stakeholder perceptions of bio-based energy. So we are thinking about looking at different categories of questions, which include the general understanding of environmental issues, understanding of how does the public really perceive the different types of feedstocks when we talk about the forest-based feedstocks versus agricultural-based feedstocks versus something like algae and so on, the food-based crops, waste like landfill waste and so on. How are these being perceived by the public? The economics, as well as the effect on public and the society, and then we'll try to look at some of the policy issues also. The second objective is to determine information gaps and develop educational materials to target these gaps. So once we have the data from the different stakeholders, we would look at where are the gaps in information, and then we would try to actually work with the outreach group here to make sure that we are actually creating the right kind of educational materials and targeting the right group with the materials that are required to fulfill these gaps. The third objective of this study that we are kind of still a little bit worried about, because this is under development, is to develop the social life cycle analysis for bio-based energy. And what this is looking at the social impacts, or the impact assessment technique that aims to assess the social and the socioeconomic aspects of the product and their potential positive and negative impacts as we go along the life cycle of the product. And so this is very similar to the environmental impact, other than the fact that we are really not looking at the environment here, but we are looking at the human and societal well-being and how that is affected. So we are planning to actually do a case study for either an existing pilot plant or a planned pilot plant in some of our focus states or focus regions. Going to the next slide. So the stakeholder groups that we are including within this study, and it's not only the general public. Actually, not only includes consumers, who are really, really important and will be the largest group that we actually look at. But also, we are going to ask questions from, the local communities, especially some of the local communities where we do have, some of the biodiesel or bioenergy refineries, and or even have, folks, forest farmland owners that are actually growing crops for the energy crops for the bioenergy industry. We're also going to look at suppliers, or the industry, including the forest products industry and the agricultural industry. We're going to talk to feedstock producers, forest and farmland owners, and get their ideas or their perceptions of what the bioenergy industry really looks like. So we're including both farmland owners and forest land owners in that particular group. Then we have researchers or academia, folks within academia, and we'll talk about, we'll discuss with these folks about their understanding of the industry, where the industry is going in the future, what kind of research needs they have. Another group that we are looking at are the environmental and social non-government organizations. And so this is not only the environmental non-government organizations, but also those other kinds of nonprofits that focus on other kinds of social issues other than the environmental side. We would definitely like to understand their perceptions, as well as how does that fit in the energy industry really fit in with their goals that they have. Another group that we're going to look at are the investment group or the investor group, and here we're looking at some of the about 10 potential investors, and these investors, we will actually talk to them about or interview them to understand their perceptions of the industry, what kind of information needs they have, what would motivate them to finance finance different projects within this industry, and it could be a biorefinery to providing money to like a group of farmers or cooperative or things like that. And the last one is intragovernmental organizations. So we're going to look at different type of governmental organizations such as EPA and other governmental organizations, lobbyists, to actually talk to them about what are their views about this particular industry. So given everybody that we're going to, all the different stakeholder groups that we have here, we are actually aiming to provide a comprehensive view of the public all across different stakeholder groups and their idea or their perceptions of the bioenergy industry. Understand the fact that, something that I should say, that the way we reach them and, the type of questions that we are going to ask them, and we need from them, information that we need from them is actually going to be different. And so we really, this is this type of study really needs a lot of rigorous work in terms of developing the type of questionnaires and surveys that we actually need to go in and ask, ask these different stakeholders within this study. So at the end, what we really want to do is to compare and contrast the different groups and see what kind of, how the information needs are different, their perceptions are different for the industry. I want to talk a little bit about a pilot study that was done in 2010 of the general public in the Southeast U.S. And the Southeast U.S., we have included 10 states, that are generally included in the Southeast U.S. here. And this study was done by a former student of mine, a master's student, Stephen Pierce, and he looked at, just explored, the different stakeholder groups, and not all the stakeholder groups, but the majority of the stakeholder groups that we talked about earlier, to ask them about their perceptions of different areas within bioenergy industry. This project was basically sponsored by the Biofuels Center of North Carolina, and so they have, I would like to thank them, for helping me share this information with everybody here. So we collected data from different stakeholder groups that included general consumers in North Carolina and other parts of the southeastern U.S., regulatory agencies and government, academia, researchers, industry professionals, forest landowners, and non-government organizations, which basically included the environmental nonprofits. And so we had data from 605 of these different stakeholder groups, and 70% of those were the general consumers. And one of the questions that we asked this group was, what is your perception of different types of energy sources in terms of their renewability or the sustainability? And I want to just kind of clarify one of the things is that we gave them the definitions of renewability and sustainability in the questionnaire itself. However, we made no distinction between renewability and sustainability, and that's one thing that we really want to include in our questionnaire going forward, because some of these different sources could be renewable, but they may not be sustainable, and some of these could be sustainable and may not be renewable. So that's something that we kind of discussed after we got the results, which happens in many of these cases. However, I still want to present the results. So in this case, we have about 395 consumers and 174 of the others that actually include, the academia, research, industry, forest landowners, non-government, and the regulatory agencies. And so I wanted to separate the consumers with the others, because what the consumers think, what we find here is that the perception of the consumers is different from that of the other folks that are a little bit more informed. You would see that the N numbers actually do not add up to 605, and one of the reasons for that was because we had 431 consumers within our study who responded to this study. However, some of them really did not respond to this particular question itself. So as you would see from the graph or from the chart here, that the energy sources that we included here are some of the energy sources that you would find on the DOE website. And we included them here, and we asked these respondents to say, to indicate what was their perception of the renewability or the sustainability. And you would see that solar, wind, hydroelectricity, geothermal kind of came up in the front, along the title. And then you have biofuel right there, which is, it really tells me that almost 60% of those that we surveyed basically thought biofuel was a renewable or a sustainable energy source. And you would see petroleum right around like 23% that think petroleum is a renewable or a sustainable resource or energy source. And so really, I mean, what this tells you is that there are two things. Number one, that there are folks, especially consumers, that think petroleum is a renewable or a sustainable fuel, and so that's, there's the information gap there. And then the other thing, that about 60% of the folks or of the stakeholders basically feel like, biofuel, are perceiving that biofuel is a renewable or a sustainable source. So we still have those 40% of the public that we really have to tackle, and we have to give, maybe provide good educational resources for them so that they understand what biofuels really mean. And as you would see here, coal's right at the end, and along with petroleum also, it comes up as about 20% of the public really thinking about it as a renewable or sustainable fuel. And as you would see, the red here basically columns indicate those of the informed public, which is what we actually really expected from the informed public. The other This slide basically talks about sources of biofuels willingness to purchase, and so we asked the public about, the stakeholders about which of the following sources would you be willing to purchase. And here we have 4 different categories. We have willing to purchase, not willing to purchase, not sure, and then never heard of biofuel from this particular source. Notice that the totals may not exceed 100%, and this is because of the way we had designed this question. Willing to purchase, not willing to purchase, and not sure, we're within like 100%. And then we also asked them in a separate column about whether you had heard about this biofuel from this particular source or not. As you would see, the first few sources of biofuels, like crop waste, wood waste, and land waste were the top 3 that people were willing to purchase, the energy from, and the biofuels for transportation from. And you would see that, I think one of the reasons why the wastes kind of come out in the front is because, when people associate something with waste, they think it's of no value. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's there. And then you would see that grasses, algae, soybeans, corn, and potatoes kind of follow that. And trees and GM trees, sorry, to the foresters here, but the trees and GM trees really come out at the end as the ones that that people are willing to purchase the biofuels from. One of the things that we need to think about is, do people even think about sources of biofuels when they are actually going to a gas station to actually purchase gas? Maybe that's not even under consideration. However, if it was under consideration, then this is something that we need to really look at. The other thing is to think about is the other category of never heard of biofuel from this particular source, and it basically tells you that there are some percentage of the public here that are not aware of biofuels from a certain source. And so about, if you kind of pick one, like GM trees or genetically modified trees, more than 20% of the general public were not aware that, genetically modified trees can be used as a source of biofuels. And, even trees, we have almost about 20% of the public or stakeholders that indicated that they were not aware of trees as a source for biofuels. Going to the next slide. Some of the other results from this study, are like sources of biofuels, and I've actually basically provided information from both, consumers and informed public, and you would see that for the consumers, the blue bar that represents the consumers is quite high in terms of whether they had heard of biofuels from a particular source or not. And you would see that GM trees are almost about 30% among the consumers, and trees, heard about tree as a source of biofuels, almost about 25% of people. Also, researchers that work in, with algae, it's probably something that most of the consumers have not really heard about. Going to the next slide. There were some statements that we asked about, there's statements about biofuels and trees and crops that we asked these stakeholders to respond to, and there were a bunch of statements, and I only wanted to present the top 5 statements that kind of came out on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 was strongly disagree and 5 was strongly agree, and some of the biofuel topics that we that we asked them about. On the top we have before I would purchase biofuels, I would like to like more information about how they would affect my vehicle. It seems to me that, and this was even more pronounced for the consumers, it seems that consumers do have some kind of a tentative opinion about how the biofuels would affect their vehicles, positively or negatively. And so it is important that that kind of fact or education be provided to them about how this would affect their vehicle, because they are a little bit skeptical about it. The second one that we found was some type of biofuels are better for the environment than others, and so we did not delve deeper into this, but in our questionnaire for the IBIS project, we are going to talk more about, what do people really think about when they think about, different types of biofuels or bioenergy sources. The third one is I would like the government to provide me with more information about biofuels. It seems that, and this kind of came up almost every time we asked questions, different type of questions to the stakeholders, that people feel that, they do not have enough information to make decisions about bioenergy or biofuels. So they are looking for more information in this area. One of the more credible sources of information was, the Department of Energy. So we had asked one of the questions about which, who among the following sources would you think is the most credible in providing you with the information? And they said, the Department of Energy would be a good one. So we're going to ask that question again and see what, how different groups actually vary on the type of sources of information that they find credible. And those, those tools would be the best way to reach the particular stakeholder group. Biofuels have a lower environmental impact than gasoline. We did find that was one of the perceptions. And then I would support cutting of trees for biofuels if for each tree cut another was replanted. So again, we in the forest industry, we know the fact that, for it's been 30, 40, 50 years, we've been trying to change the public's perception about forest management and cutting of trees. It's not always bad, but it's something that I think in the people's perceptions and in the people's minds. And so that's one area that we really need to tackle even now when we think about the bioenergy projects. Going to the next slide, and this is the last slide for the pilot study that we did. We also, in this case, in this slide, I've taken out all the responses from the forest landowners, and we had forest landowners as one of the stakeholder groups, and 43 of the forest landowners across North Carolina and the other southeast states actually responded to the questionnaire. And you would see, that some of the questions or some of the statements that rank high, on their agenda, on the forest landowners' agenda, are dealing with the feedstocks. And so, if you look at some of the questions on genetic modifications, they indicate that they would support genetically modified trees used for biofuels if it meant that it's going to lower our imports of oil from overseas. So really, everybody is concerned about, forest landowners especially concerned about, how do we make ourselves more energy independent. That's what I would think, looking at this. I would support genetically modified trees and crops if it allowed the biofuel industry to lower their environmental impact. That also kind of points towards the same thing. The environmental impacts are something that this particular group is concerned about. I would support genetically modified trees if they were used for species restoration or for resistant diseases, and this is one of the questions that our sponsor was interested in, so we had it in there. Genetically modified trees and crops have the ability to provide an adequate supply of biomass to create biofuels, and so on and so forth. You would also see that we did have support for growing genetically modified crops, and if you kind of go to the last 2 points there, you would see that the forest landowners are saying that the genetically modified crops are not harmful for us and they're not unethical. Given, if you go to look at the disagree column here, almost 59% said that, and 79% are saying that it is, it is not unethical. However, there are also others that feel the other way. There are almost 40% of the forest landowners. They're thinking that genetically modified crops are harmful, and so these questions were in general for GM based trees and crops. And so, I did want to present it here. Although we have only 43 forest landowners and information from them, it could be a little bit biased, depending on who responded to the questionnaire. And so those are some of the things that we are actually planning to reduce. Those kind of biases we are planning to reduce as we go forward with the IBIS project in constructing our questionnaire and in reaching the forest landowners to get them to complete our survey. Going to the next slide. Now, given all these information that we obtained from the pilot survey, pilot study, we're actually going forward with creating questionnaires and looking at a methodology for collecting data from the different stakeholder groups. We are currently working on our questionnaire design, and we've finished our first draft for the questionnaire design for forest landowner group, the farm landowner group, and the consumers. And we're going to start data collection early next year, because I think this is the holiday time and we really don't want to disturb people by asking them about these surveys. It's not a good time to get good responses, and so we're going to wait until the start of the year to collect data. We are also compiling stakeholder databases for each of the groups that are important to us now in the second year. So in the second year of the project, we are focusing on three important groups, or four important groups, I should say. The consumer group, the general public. We do have the forest and the farmland owners, these two groups that we are collecting data from. And then the fourth group are the investment community. And so in the first 2 years, we plan to complete data collection from them and completely analyze that data for these four groups, and then we would move towards the other groups like industry and non-profits, and looking at the communities and also doing the social life cycle analysis. So our method is to compile the stakeholder database, which we are currently doing, administer the questionnaires by email or mail survey, and we are also planning some personal interviews given the population type and the characteristic that we are looking at. For example, we will collect data from consumers via email, whereas we are going to look at mail survey for forest and farmland owners, because that's pretty much the only way we can get data from them. Personal interviews are very expensive for those two groups if we really want a good sample size. We have to go with mail survey. Personal interviews, for example, we are going to conduct with the investment community, because that's the best way to get questions and get responses to our questions. And we're going to send reminders and end data collection sometime around early end of April, May, and do data analysis to compare it across different stakeholder groups. So by the time we finish the second year of the project, we should have data from and should have analyzed the data for these groups. So currently, given our reduced budget for IBIS, we are actually focusing on North Carolina and Tennessee and doing comprehensive data analysis on these two states. We're not going to look at other states, so we bias the data, or we do not collect enough data from different states to actually compare different states. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus completely on North Carolina and focus completely on Tennessee, and then we will actually get data from comprehensive data from the different stakeholder groups for these two states. The stakeholder groups that we are focusing on in the first 2 years, and we already talked about it, are the consumer groups, the forest and the farmland owners, and the investment community. The data collection is for the questionnaires, could be mail and electronic, and the schedule is January to May 2013 for all the three groups. Looking at the consumer survey, we are actually using a database called InfoUSA 2012. It pretty much has over a data or email addresses from over 200 million people in the U.S. And so we are going to stratify the consumers in each of these states, in North Carolina and Tennessee, and for the demography, because we definitely want a random population that we can draw our results from, or we can basically interpret our results to, so our sample should be representative of the population in these two states. And so we're going to stratify it to make sure that we get enough, we get the representation of gender, for example, and different age groups, and people in different races, to actually make sure that we have everybody include all the different demographic groups within our survey. It is true that the consumer surveys are very difficult to do, and normally we get about 1 to 2% response rate. That's very typical for consumer surveys, and so we will select our database based on the fact that we are going to get about 1 to 2% of completed surveys. If we get more than that, we would be very happy and we'll take that. So total completed surveys, we have about 1,000 across the 2 states. That's what we are planning to complete. Data collection is electronic questionnaire. We have major categories of questions that include concerns for the environment, energy, the general economy, what kind of green orientation people have, understanding of renewable energy and bioenergy feedstocks, their willingness to purchase, perceptions about bioenergy. We're talking about all different types of perceptions, social, economic, technical, and policy-based impacts of the bioenergy industry, and information needs and the source of information. What kind of information are they looking for in this that would help them make better decisions or to understand the industry better, and then demography. For the forest and farmland owner survey, the easiest and the most difficult, I have to say, is to kind of compile the database for these 2 different stakeholder groups. We're actually going to county tax records in both the states to look at, get the list of forest and farmland owners. This would be stratified for regional differences across North Carolina and Tennessee. For example, in North Carolina, we have mountains and the Piedmont and the coastal region, and so we want to make sure that we are stratifying for regional differences so we can capture the regional differences in North Carolina. And also in Tennessee, with the 3 different areas, we're actually going to be making sure that we are looking at the regional differences. We're focusing on rural areas because we feel like the urban population is not really going to provide us with a good sample that is representative of where the forest and the farmland owners are actually going to grow the crops for the bioenergy industry. So we're focusing on the rural areas. We're going to take 20 counties across the 3 regions per state, and based on the size of the land holdings of the forest and farmland owners. Total completed surveys, we are thinking about 500 across the 2 groups, across the 2 states. Data collection will be by mail questionnaire, and the major categories of questions we're including are pretty much similar to the consumer group, but we're going to ask them more about their awareness of the bioenergy feedstocks like trees and crops, their motivation that would help them grow these bioenergy crops, their information needs and sources of information, and their land information area, existing land use, what kind of sustainable management they're following. Going to the next slide, talking about the investment community, because this is also an important aspect of the stakeholder survey that we are actually looking at, or the stakeholder perceptions. And so we are currently compiling the database from our personal contacts. Now you have to understand the fact that this investment community, number one, it's very difficult to reach them, and unless we have some personal contact with them, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually talk to them. They normally don't have time for people to answer surveys or to answer questions. So we're trying to get to a list that would not be biased, that would not be biased towards this industry, but we might, and so we would try to look for an unbiased list and go and talk to the investors that have, that may not have invested within this industry at all yet, and to talk about, their motivations. What would motivate them to finance this bioenergy project? So we're looking at completing 10 surveys across the U.S. And data collection, is personal interviews using a structured questionnaire. And major category of questions would include understanding of the renewable energy markets, perceptions about bioenergy in the social, economic, technical, and policy areas, information needs and gaps in information that will help them or motivate them to finance the bioenergy projects. And then we'll also look at some of the size of finance projects previously and type of projects that they have financed. The other aspect, if we move away from the bioenergy, from looking at the perceptions, is how do we, is actually to look at the social life cycle analysis. Like I said earlier, this is an impact assessment technique that will aim to assess the social and the socioeconomic aspects of products and their potential positive and negative impacts as you think about the supply chain across the life cycle of the product. And so, if we are looking at social life cycle analysis, which is similar to the environmental life cycle analysis, where we do have indicators and we have life cycle inventory and so on. However, the fact that for SLCAs, these, or the social life cycle analysis, these indicators have not really been set up yet. It's not structured, it's not formatted, and one of the reasons for that is because it is a very, very new aspect of the life cycle analysis when we think about it. Whereas the environmental and the economic life cycle analysis is, there are many standards that exist. For social life cycle analysis, there are no standards. So that's one of the things that we are planning to do with this research. We will be looking at different type of impact categories, like the environmental impact categories of carbon dioxide and human toxicity, and air pollution and so on. In this case, we are looking at impact categories that are related to human rights, access to resources, where everybody has equitable access to resources or not, employment and community engagement. So if we do have a pilot plant or a biorefinery plant that a company is planning to build around an area, how much employment and community engagement they're doing to make sure that they're taking care of some of the social aspects of building that biorefinery in that place. Working conditions within the biorefinery, health and safety aspects, if there is some kind of cultural heritage that's being affected by that particular project, that's also something that's taken into account. Socioeconomic repercussions, and overall, looking at the well-being, happiness, and quality of life of people. I've provided one of the examples here. For example, if we are looking at different stakeholders, we're looking at workers, for example, in the production environment. Is there child labor? Is there forced labor? How is the and then we actually look at assess the different aspects like the health and safety, socioeconomic repercussions, human rights, and so on and so forth, and look at what kind of effect it's having in the assessment column there. Similarly, you look at society, or you look at different stakeholder groups and how they are being affected because of a particular project being undertaken. So if you go to the left and you look at the left, where we have life cycle inventory, assessing key stakeholders, attitudes and perceptions, and then identifying social benefits and risks based on that, we're thinking that some of the information that we actually collect from our surveys is going to really feed into the social life cycle assessment. And once we have those assessments, what we are planning to do is to take the results of the ELCA, or the environmental LCA that Dr. Richard Benzitti and others are actually doing, and to integrate the social aspects that we learn into the environmental LCA. So we're not only looking at the ton of carbohydrates per acre or the dollars per acre, but we're also looking at the social benefits and risks as you kind of go through the entire life cycle or the supply chain. So our idea or our goal here is to make sure that we can integrate the social benefits and risks in accordance with the different life cycle principles, as we are looking at the economic and the environmental risks and benefits also through the life cycle, so that we can create a readiness index by normalizing or weighting the social benefits with the economic and the environmental benefits, and create some kind of a readiness indicator for a particular region, let's say for North Carolina. And so with that, I think that is the last slide that I have. I would take any questions that you have. I think Robert Barton, if you can help me, maybe people have questions. I really haven't been able to see any questions that anybody wrote, but I would be happy to answer them.
So if anybody has questions at this time, we ask, feel free to type them into the chat window. Or if you have a microphone and you'd like to have privileges to turn on your microphone, go ahead and raise your hand, and we can take questions verbally also. So here's a question from Steve Taylor. He's asking, what is your plan, or our plan, for getting your results to the ETO groups?
Yeah, I think that's Steve. That's a great question, and we were thinking that once we do have, one of the things that we are going to do is, of course, we've just finished the first draft of our questionnaire for these different stakeholder groups. What we are going to do is to run it by everybody that is involved within this project. And as well as other CAP projects, they are doing the same thing. And so we're hoping that we can get inputs from you guys in on the questionnaires itself, so that we know that there is the ETO group that is actually looking at this and thinking about this when we are collecting as we are collecting data. So what we're going to do is, once we have the data, we will share that with all of you. Once we have the results, we can actually either share the data set with you guys, or we can also share the results with you all and look at, so that we can help you actually look at the gaps in information and are the major findings that we have in the study, so that the ETO group can actually look at it and say, okay, these are the areas that we really need to concentrate on as we go out and start educating or think about outreach tools that we are actually going to utilize for this project. I hope I've answered your question.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Sudipta? So here's one from Burton. He's wondering why only Tennessee and North Carolina on the Southeast Landowner Survey.
Yeah, I know. That's a question that we actually pondered quite a bit on that, and we had first kind of started with the entire Southeast. Number one, creating the database is a massive amount of work for each and every state. And of course, when we started looking at whether we can only pick some states, where we can get the data, from, because it will probably take us a long time to actually create the database for all, the entire Southeast. We thought, it would probably be a good idea to concentrate on a few specific states. And so we did pick out, North Carolina and Tennessee, because, of course, we have good contacts there and in each of these states to just make the process easier for us. But also, that's just the answer that probably, that I did not want to say, but also the fact that, it would be a good idea to actually concentrate on a few areas where we can really get very, very good information. And so we decided that given the timing and the costs, it would probably be a good idea to just pick these two states. Okay.
Here's a question from Steve Taylor again. Early in your slides, you showed popularity of feedstocks for biofuels. Do I remember correctly that trees were less popular than corn?
That is right. That's right. That's what the people were saying. So if you go back here, so sources of biofuels willingness to purchase. And when we looked at this at first, we also were shocked, because we were thinking, given the food and the fuel debate, that this is not going to be what it's actually showing, but this is true. And if we just filter the consumer group, or filter the informed group out of this, it's exactly the same, that we get the same results that we get here. That is, corn are more popular as compared to trees and GM trees. And I think one of the reasons could be that the people, the general public, probably has not heard about trees and GM trees being sources of biofuels, so that might be something that could have affected this. But we did say very specifically that provided that the biofuels for transportation were available from the following sources, does it really matter where it actually really comes from? Okay, does the sources really matter? And so you're right, this stumped us also, but this is what it is. This is what the data basically said.
Okay, here's a comment from Burton. It would seem to me that Georgia with its pine might have been a better selection, and this is in reference to his question about Tennessee and North Carolina and the Southeast Landowner Survey.
Yeah, you're probably right, and again, this is probably a convenient sampling that we are doing. We haven't talked at all about increasing this to like the others, or expanding this to the other states at this point, for the first couple of years. But given if we do have, we do have the next 3 years, following that, where we can do this same study for Georgia and maybe like a couple other states. So that's a good question. We'll keep that in mind, and we'll discuss that, and see if we can really do it, if we can include like another state, we would actually love to do that in the following 3 years, because we do have time actually to expand the study. Any other questions? Bob, am I hearing any other questions from anyone?
Waiting to see if Burton has anything to follow up. There's just been a couple comments. One from Jessica that says, Tim Ryle says North Carolina is also characterized by lots of pine, and that is true. And then Steve Taylor, of course, says, good seminar, thanks. And then Burton said, we found that grasses and wastes were more acceptable than trees in creation of ethanol.
Yeah, that's very good, because that really does support what you're saying, does support what we have in here. That crop waste, wood waste, and landfill waste were the first ones to come up here, and trees and GM trees were at the end. But some of the other studies like you were talking about probably follow the same thing. One of the things that we were thinking about doing in the present study is to make sure that we provide a definition to waste, because I think some of our thought process was that all the three wastes kind of came up in the front because people think these are of zero value, and you're really adding some value to it. But they are, if you really think about it, it's not of zero value. It's of maybe the way it's being used currently in the market is lower value, but it may not be zero value altogether. So thank you for your comment.
So, and the last question, again from Burton, is he thanks you for today's seminar and is wondering, are the slides available for others?
Absolutely. I think we can provide the slides. I'll let Lori, who was helping me actually handle this, or I don't know how we really handle it during our using our webinar. I can send it to Jessica, and she could probably send it out to everybody. We could do that. And that way everybody will have like a copy of the slides, and that would be helpful. So I'll talk to Jessica, and we'll see how we can really provide the slides to everybody.
Okay, with that, I'd like to take this moment to thank Sudipta for all her time in putting today's webinar together for IBIS. We do appreciate it. And again, thank you all for joining today's session.
Thank you all, and thank you, Bob, for moderating it. Really appreciate it.